Hello everyone, I'm Creepy Raindrops, and I'm here to assist you today. I know many of you use this video to unwind and fall asleep. So, before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Get cozy, relax, and let yourself drift into calm. The Haunting of Hill House. A Tale of Forgotten Souls. It was late October of 1983, the air crisp with the scent of decaying leaves, as Alex Warren drove up the winding path to Hill House. Nestled in the dense woods of western Massachusetts, the mansion had a grim reputation that stretched back more than a century. Alex, a journalist in his mid-30s, had been drawn to the property by whispers of its dark past. Disappearances, untimely deaths, and the inexplicable madness that seemed to plague anyone who lingered too long. The house loomed in the pale light of the full moon, its weathered stone walls draped in ivy, windows staring like hollow eyes. Alex stopped his car at the rusted iron gate, its hinges groaning in protest as he pushed it open. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he approached the grand oak doors, their surface scarred and pitted with age. Inside, the air was heavy, stagnant. The grand foyer stretched out before him, with a spiral staircase winding upward into shadows. Dust motes danced in the dim light filtering through cracked stained glass windows, casting eerie patterns on the walls. A massive chandelier hung precariously overhead, its crystals dulled by decades of neglect. Alex set down his duffel bag and pulled out his camera, the whir of the lens echoing unnaturally in the silence. His assignment was simple: document the house for a Halloween feature in his magazine. But as he walked deeper into the house, something about the atmosphere unsettled him. It was not just the decay, it was the feeling of being watched. The first night passed without incident, though sleep eluded Alex. The faint creaks of the house settling seemed deliberate, almost purposeful, like footsteps pacing just beyond his bedroom door. At one point, around 3 a.m., he thought he heard faint whispers, too faint to make out the words, but distinct enough to raise the hairs on the back of his neck. By the second day, Alex began to explore the upper floors. He found old photographs scattered across the floor of the study, grainy images of a family in the early 1900s. A stern-faced man in a suit, a woman with hollow eyes, and 3 children, all staring into the camera with expressions too somber for their age. On the back of one photograph was scribbled a single word in faded ink: "Stay." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house in shadow, Alex discovered the attic door. It was slightly ajar, a cold draft seeping out. He hesitated before climbing the narrow stairs, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The attic was filled with old trunks, broken furniture, and a single rocking chair positioned in the center of the room. It creaked softly, though no one was there to push it. "Hello," Alex called, his voice trembling. The chair stopped abruptly. He felt the temperature drop sharply, his breath visible in the frigid air. Suddenly he heard it, a child's laughter, faint and melodic, coming from the corner of the attic. Swinging his flashlight toward the sound, he saw nothing but cobwebs and shadows. That night, he decided to sleep in the parlor downstairs, feeling safer closer to an exit. Around midnight, he awoke to the sound of a piano playing. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, yet disjointed, as if played by someone who hadn't touched the keys in years. The parlor didn't have a piano. Alex grabbed his flashlight and crept toward the music, which seemed to emanate from the dining room. As he pushed open the door, the music stopped. The dining table, once set for 12, was covered in a thin layer of dust, except for one spot where the dust had been wiped away, revealing a place setting for one. A single candle sat there, unlit. "Who's there?" Alex demanded, his voice echoing in the vast room. A whisper answered him, so close it seemed to come from just over his shoulder. "You shouldn't have come." Alex froze, his breath caught in his throat. He spun around, flashlight trembling in his grip, but no one was there. The room seemed to close in on him, the shadows stretching and twisting in ways they shouldn't. The faint smell of roses drifted past, followed by the metallic tang of blood. He backed away slowly, his heart pounding. "This isn't real," he muttered under his breath, retreating to the parlor. "It's just my imagination." But deep down, Alex knew better. Hill House was alive in ways he couldn't explain. The next morning, the sunlight did little to dispel the unease that had settled over him. Determined to make sense of what he had experienced, Alex searched the house more thoroughly. In the library, he found an old journal buried beneath a pile of decaying books. The cover was embossed with the initials JC, and inside were entries dated back to 1907. The journal belonged to Jonathan Crane, the stern-faced man from the photographs. As Alex flipped through the brittle pages, he pieced together a story of tragedy. Jonathan had moved into Hill House with his family in 1905, hoping to escape the city's chaos. But soon after their arrival, strange occurrences began to plague them. Phantom voices, cold drafts, and objects moving on their own. The final entry sent a chill through Alex's spine. "The house whispers to us now, calling us by name. My youngest, Eleanor, says she sees children playing in her room at night. They tell her secrets, dark things no child should know. I've tried to leave, but the house won't let us. It holds us here, as if we belong to it. If anyone finds this journal, beware. Hill House is not a home. It is a prison." As Alex closed the journal, he felt the distinct sensation of being watched again. He turned sharply toward the library door and caught the briefest glimpse of a shadowy figure slipping out of sight. The air grew colder, the faint sound of footsteps retreating down the hall. He followed, his heart hammering in his chest. The footsteps led him to the basement, the heavy wooden door slightly ajar. The smell of damp earth and mildew wafted up as he descended the creaking stairs. His flashlight flickered, then dimmed, casting only faint light in the oppressive darkness. "Who's down here?" Alex called, his voice shaking. The only response was the sound of something scraping against the stone floor. As he turned the corner, his light fell on a large, iron-bound chest in the center of the room. The scraping sound grew louder, coming from inside the chest. Alex hesitated, his instinct screaming at him to leave. But curiosity got the better of him. He approached the chest, the air around him so cold now that frost was forming on the stone walls. With trembling hands, he lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of children's toys, wooden blocks, a doll with glass eyes, and a small, tarnished music box. Alex exhaled in relief, but before he could step away, the music box began to play on its own. The tune was the same haunting melody he had heard the night before. Then, a child's voice whispered from behind him, "Help us." Alex spun around, the flashlight shaking so violently in his hand that the beam danced across the damp stone walls. Nothing was there. Only the echo of the child's voice lingered, bouncing softly off the walls like a fading plea. "Who are you?" Alex stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. For a long moment, The basement was silent. Then, a faint giggle floated through the air, chilling and hollow. The flashlight flickered again before going out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Alex fumbled for his phone, using its weak glow to navigate back toward the stairs. But as he reached the bottom step, a cold hand clamped around his wrist. "Don't leave," a voice hissed, low and guttural, nothing like the child's. Alex screamed and yanked his arm free, scrambling up the stairs and slamming the door behind him. His chest heaved as he leaned against it, heart racing like a trapped animal. Whatever was in the basement, it didn't want him to go. He staggered back into the parlor, adrenaline coursing through him. This wasn't just a haunted house. It was something far worse. He needed to leave. Now, grabbing his keys and duffel bag, Alex rushed to the front door. But when he twisted the knob, it wouldn't budge. He tried again, using all his strength, but the door refused to open. Panic set in as he ran to the windows, only to find them sealed shut. It was as if the house had come alive, determined to trap him inside. "You can't leave," came a whisper from behind him. He turned, and there she was, a little girl standing in the middle of the foyer. She wore a tattered white dress, her bare feet dirty, her hair tangled. But it was her eyes that struck Alex the most. They were hollow, like dark wells that seemed to pull him in. "Who are you?" Alex asked, his voice trembling. The girl tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Eleanor," she said softly. "I've been waiting for someone to help us." Alex's breath caught. Eleanor, the youngest child from the photographs and Jonathan Crane's journal. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She stepped closer, her movements unervingly smooth. "The house took us. It keeps us here, just like it's keeping you." "No," Alex said, shaking his head. "I'm leaving. I'll find a way out." Eleanor's expression darkened. "You can try," she said, her voice suddenly layered with something ancient and menacing. "But the house doesn't like it when people disobey." Before Alex could respond, the chandelier overhead began to sway violently, its crystals clinking like a sinister wind chime. The walls groaned, and the floor beneath him vibrated. He stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding a falling piece of plaster. "Eleanor, please," he begged. "How do I get out?" The girl's form flickered, her features twisting into something grotesque before returning to her childlike appearance. "You'll have to play the game," she whispered. "What game?" Alex demanded. But Eleanor simply smiled, her figure fading into the shadows as the house seemed to come alive around him. Doors slammed in the distance, and the whispers returned louder now, filling the air with overlapping voices. Alex fell to his knees, clutching his head as the whispers became screams. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. The house fell silent, but Alex wasn't alone. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Dozens of shadowy figures emerged from the walls, their faces gaunt and expressionless, their eyes empty voids. They surrounded him, their presence suffocating. One figure stepped forward, a man in an old-fashioned suit with hollow cheeks and cold eyes. It was Jonathan Crane. "You shouldn't have come," Crane said, his voice echoing like thunder in Alex's mind. Alex stared at Jonathan Crane, frozen in terror. The air around him seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, pressing against his chest, until breathing became a struggle. "I didn't know," Alex stammered, his voice shaking. "I didn't know what this place was." Jonathan's hollow eyes narrowed. "Ignorance does not absolve you." Hill House chooses who it keeps. You are here because you're already marked. Marked, Alex whispered. The shadows behind Jonathan shifted, restless, their forms flickering like smoke. They whispered, their voices overlapping in an eerie symphony. Words, some intelligible, others incomprehensible, pressed against Alex's mind. Stay, help, run, no escape. Jonathan leaned closer, his cold breath brushing Alex's face. The house feeds on what you bring with you. Your guilt, your fear, your secrets. It will dig deep, Alex, and it will not let you leave until it has consumed everything. Alex's throat tightened. No, I don't have secrets. I don't. Jonathan's expression darkened. Don't lie to me, boy. The house already knows. Before Alex could respond, the shadows surged forward, engulfing him in a suffocating darkness. He felt their icy touch clawing at his skin, pulling at his thoughts, dragging him somewhere deeper. Suddenly, he was no longer in the foyer. He found himself in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with peeling floral wallpaper, and a single chair sat in the center of the room. On the chair was a man, his wrists and ankles bound with thick rope, his face pale and drawn. Alex's breath hitched as recognition washed over him. It was his father, Dad. Alex choked out, his voice cracking. The man's head snapped up, his eyes bloodshot and accusing. Why didn't you help me, Alex? Alex stumbled backward, shaking his head. No, this isn't real. You're not real. You left me there, his father hissed, his voice trembling with anger. You knew I needed you, but you ran. You were too afraid. Tears streamed down Alex's face as the memories he had tried to bury clawed their way to the surface. His father's drunken rage. The night Alex had fled the house instead of staying to protect his younger sister. The guilt had haunted him for years, but he had never spoken of it. This isn't real, Alex shouted, his voice breaking. It's the house. It's messing with my head. But the figure in the chair only smiled, a twisted, knowing smile. The house doesn't lie, Alex. You can't run from what you've done. The room began to spin, the walls warping and dissolving until Alex was back in the foyer of Hill House. He fell to his knees, gasping for air. The shadows were gone, but the weight of what he had seen pressed down on him like a boulder. Jonathan Crane's voice echoed from the shadows. It will show you more, Alex. Every sin, every failure, every regret. It will strip you bare until there's nothing left. Alex clenched his fists, his body trembling. No, he said through gritted teeth. I won't let it win. There has to be a way out. There has to be. From somewhere deep within the house, a door creaked open. The sound reverberated through the halls like a taunt. Jonathan's voice came again, softer now, almost pitying. If you want to leave, Alex, you must confront it all. But be warned, many have tried. None have succeeded. Alex stood, his legs weak, but his resolve hardening. He glanced toward the dark hallway where the sound had come from. The open door seemed to beckon him, the air around it shimmering faintly like heat waves. He swallowed hard and took a step forward. The hallway stretched before Alex like a gaping maw, its walls narrowing and twisting as if the house were alive and shifting around him. The open door at the end glowed faintly, an otherworldly light spilling out and pulsing like a heartbeat. Each step Alex took felt heavier, the air thick with a palpable tension. The faint scent of roses returned, but it was undercut by something acrid, like burning wood. The whispers followed him, growing louder, their cadence almost rhythmic, like a chant. Come, see, face. When he reached the door, Alex hesitated. He could feel the energy radiating from the room beyond, a cold yet magnetic pull that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He pushed the door open. The room inside was nothing like the rest of the house. It was impossibly vast, the walls stretching into darkness. The floor was made of polished black stone, reflecting Alex's face in eerie detail. In the center of the room stood a mirror, tall and ornate, its golden frame intricately carved, with faces frozen in expressions of agony and fear. Alex approached cautiously, his reflection growing clearer with each step. But when he stood before the mirror, what he saw wasn't himself. The reflection was distorted, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow, like the shadowy figures he'd seen earlier. Behind him, countless figures loomed, their outlines faint but unmistakably human. They stood silently, their gazes locked on Alex, as if waiting for him to act. He reached out toward the mirror, his fingers trembling. As soon as they brushed the cold glass, the room shifted violently. The figures in the mirror stepped forward, emerging from the reflective surface like ghosts made flesh. They surrounded Alex, their faces clearer now, twisted and pained, some familiar, others foreign. One of them stepped forward. It was Eleanor. "You have to face it," she said, her voice echoing in the vast space. "All of it. Only then will you understand." "Understand what?" Alex demanded, his voice rising in frustration. "Why this house is doing this to me. Why I'm trapped here." Eleanor's expression softened, almost pitying. "The house isn't doing this, Alex. You are." The figures around him began to murmur, their whispers blending into a cacophony of voices. The mirror shimmered again, the surface rippling like water. This time, it showed scenes from Alex's life, moments he had buried deep. There was the night he left home, his father shouting after him, the sound of his sister's cries fading as he walked out the door. The time he ignored a desperate call from an old friend, too preoccupied with his own problems to notice their pain. And the day he stood by silently as a colleague was unfairly blamed for his own mistake at work. "No," Alex said, shaking his head. "I tried to move on. I didn't mean for any of it to happen." The figures circled him, their murmurs growing louder. "Coward, liar. You knew." Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. "The house shows you what you bring. You can't run from it anymore. If you want to leave, you must confront it. Own it." Alex clenched his fists, his breath ragged. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. The ground beneath him cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading across the black stone. From the cracks came a fiery glow, and the voices grew deafening. "Enough!" Alex shouted, his voice echoing like a thunderclap. "I'm not perfect, but I'm trying." "Isn't that enough?" The room fell silent. The figures stopped moving, their gazes fixed on Alex. Eleanor tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Maybe it is," she said softly. The mirror surface rippled again, this time showing the front door of Hill House. It was open, sunlight streaming through. Alex stared at the image, his chest tightening with hope. "Is this real? I can leave." Eleanor stepped aside, gesturing toward the mirror. "The way out is yours to take. But remember, the house never forgets." Alex hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. The mirror's surface shimmered as he passed through, and he found himself standing in the foyer once more. The front door stood open, the crisp autumn air beckoning him. He didn't look back as he ran toward the exit, the sunlight warming his face as he stepped outside. But as he reached his car and looked back at Hill House, he saw a faint figure standing in the window. Eleanor, her hollow eyes watching him, her lips forming a single, silent word, "Remember." Alex sat in his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His breath came in short gasps as he tried to process what had just happened. The house loomed behind him, silent and still, yet he could feel its presence, as though it were watching him leave. He turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, a sound so grounding and real that it momentarily broke the spell of the house. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror, his blood ran cold. Eleanor was there, sitting in the back seat. "Don't forget," she whispered, her voice soft yet piercing. Alex screamed, whipping around to face the back seat. It was empty. His heart hammered in his chest as he sat frozen, unsure of what was real anymore. The air inside the car felt heavy, suffocating, as if the house's grip hadn't entirely let go. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "I'm done. I'm leaving." He slammed the car into gear and sped down the overgrown driveway, the trees closing in around him like skeletal hands. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though trying to pull him back. As he reached the main road, the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly. The sunlight felt brighter, warmer, and for the first time in hours, Alex began to feel like he might actually be free. But something gnawed at him, a lingering sense of unease, like an itch he couldn't scratch. The words from Eleanor, Jonathan Crane, and even the whispers of the house echoed in his mind. The house never forgets. He drove for hours, putting as much distance as possible between himself and Hill House. By the time he reached the outskirts of a small town, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of red and orange. Exhausted and desperate for normalcy, Alex pulled into a diner. Inside, the warm glow of the lights and the hum of quiet conversation were a welcome contrast to the horrors he had faced. He sat at a corner booth, ordering coffee and a sandwich, hoping the routine of eating might ground him. As he sipped his coffee, he noticed an older man at the counter watching him. The man's eyes were sharp, his expression serious. Finally, he stood and approached Alex's table. "You've been to Hill House, haven't you?" the man asked, his voice low. Alex froze, the coffee cup halfway to his lips. "What? How do you?" The man pulled up a chair and sat down. "You look like someone who's seen it. That place, it leaves a mark. You can never truly leave it behind." Alex's throat tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man chuckled darkly. "Sure you do. The house has a way of getting inside you. It feeds on what you try to bury. And if you're lucky enough to leave, well," he leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper, "it follows you." Alex's stomach turned. He pushed his plate away, no longer hungry. "What do you mean, it follows you?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled photograph, sliding it across the table. Alex hesitated before picking it up. The photo was old and faded, but the image was clear. Hill House, surrounded by thick fog. Standing in front of it was a group of people, men and women, their faces solemn, and among them, Alex saw himself. His blood turned to ice. This isn't possible," he stammered. "That's not me." The man leaned back, his expression grim. "It's you, all right. It gets everyone eventually." The house doesn't just trap you, son. It makes you part of it. Alex dropped the photograph, his hands shaking. He wanted to deny it, to scream that it wasn't true. But deep down, he felt it. The faint pull of Hill House, like a thread tied to his soul. The lights in the diner flickered, and for a brief moment, Alex thought he saw Eleanor's reflection in the window. The man stood, placing a firm hand on Alex's shoulder. You might have left the house, but it hasn't left you. Watch yourself. It's only a matter of time. As the man walked away, Alex sat frozen, the whispers from Hill House creeping back into his mind. And as he looked out the window into the gathering darkness, he realized something chilling. The road he had taken to escape the house now seemed eerily familiar. It was leading him back. Alex bolted upright in his seat, his breath quick and shallow. He shoved the photograph off the table, its crumpled edges falling to the floor. The diner suddenly felt too small, the air too thick to breathe. The hum of chatter around him dimmed, replaced by faint whispers that felt like they were crawling under his skin. He turned toward the window again, his eyes scanning the darkened street outside. For a moment, the world seemed normal. Cars passing, streetlights flickering. But just beneath that surface was something he couldn't shake, the feeling of being watched. He reached for his wallet and threw a few bills onto the table, stumbling out of the diner and into the cool night air. His car sat in the parking lot under a flickering street lamp, but as he approached it, he stopped. There, written in the condensation on the rear window, were 3 words, "Still watching you." Alex froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. He looked around, searching for anyone nearby, but the street was empty. Slowly, he wiped the words away with his sleeve, his hand trembling. "No," he muttered under his breath. "This isn't real. It's just the house messing with me." But even as he said it, the weight of those words pressed down on him. The house had been left behind, miles away, yet its presence lingered like a shadow he couldn't escape. He climbed into the car and locked the doors, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. He didn't dare look in the rear-view mirror. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, the glowing beams of his headlights cutting through the dark. The journey back to his motel was a blur. He barely registered the winding roads or the small towns he passed. All he could think about was getting somewhere safe, somewhere with light and people. When he finally pulled into the motel parking lot, Alex exhaled a shaky breath. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a sickly red glow over the lot. He grabbed his duffel bag from the back seat and hurried toward his room, the cold night air nipping at his heels. Inside, the room was sparse but comforting in its simplicity. A bed, a small TV, and a bathroom. He locked the door, checked it twice, and shoved a chair under the doorknob for good measure. He sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. For the first time since leaving Hill House, he allowed himself to cry. The fear, the guilt, the overwhelming sense of helplessness. It all came pouring out. But as his sobs quieted, he became aware of something else. The whispers. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But they grew louder, closer, filling the room with their insidious murmur. Alex looked up, his heart racing. The bathroom door was ajar, the light inside flickering. He stared at it, paralyzed. He hadn't turned that light on. "Hello," he called out, his voice cracking. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse, heavy and suffocating. Alex slowly rose to his feet, his eyes locked on the bathroom door. As he approached, the light flickered more violently, casting jagged shadows across the walls. He pushed the door open, his breath caught in his throat. The mirror above the sink was fogged over, and written in the condensation were the same 3 words, "Still watching you." Behind him, in the reflection, Eleanor stood. Her face was pale, her hollow eyes fixed on him, and her lips curved into a faint, haunting smile. Alex spun around, but the bathroom was empty. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and echoing, filling every corner of the small room. The light bulb burst, plunging him into darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the whispers stopped. The motel room was silent again. Alex stumbled back into the main room, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He fumbled for his phone. The screen's glow a small comfort in the suffocating dark. The screen lit up with a new message. It was from an unknown number. The text read, "You can't outrun us, Alex. Come back. Finish what you started." His phone buzzed again, another message appearing. This one was a photo. It was of him, sitting on the motel bed. The photo had been taken just moments ago. Alex dropped his phone, his breath catching in his throat. The photograph felt like a weight in his chest. A horrifying confirmation that no matter how far he ran, he was never truly alone. He scrambled to pick up the device, his fingers trembling as he unlocked it again. The screen remained still for a moment, but then another message popped up. "Look outside." "No, no, no," Alex whispered, backing away from the window. His heart pounded against his ribs, his body frozen in place. He couldn't look. He wouldn't. But the curiosity, the gnawing fear that if he didn't, something worse might happen, drove him forward. Slowly, he approached the curtain, the fabric trembling as he reached out to pull it aside. The parking lot outside was bathed in the faint red glow of the motel's neon sign. It seemed empty at first, eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the buzzing sign. Then he saw it. A figure stood beneath the street lamp near his car, its outline unmistakably human, but unnervingly still. It didn't move, didn't breathe. Alex couldn't make out its face, but he knew, he felt, it was watching him. As if sensing his gaze, the figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion. Alex's phone buzzed again. The vibration startled him so badly that he nearly dropped it. He glanced down at the screen. "Let us in." He stumbled back from the window, shaking his head. "No, this isn't real. It can't be real." The room felt colder now, the temperature dropping so quickly that Alex could see his breath. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers returned, louder this time, as though they were right next to him. Desperate, Alex grabbed the chair blocking the door and flung it aside. He yanked open the door, intending to make a run for his car. But as soon as he stepped outside, the figure under the street lamp was gone. The parking lot stretched out before him, empty and silent. He sprinted toward his car, fumbling with his keys as he unlocked it and dove inside. The door slammed shut behind him, and he locked it instantly, his chest heaving. The silence inside the car was suffocating, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing. But then, from the back seat, a soft voice broke through the quiet. "You can't run forever, Alex." He didn't turn around. He didn't dare. The voice continued, calm and steady, yet filled with something ancient and cold. "You think leaving the house meant you escaped? You think you can forget what you've seen, what you've done?" Alex's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "Leave me alone," he whispered. just leave me alone." The voice laughed softly, a chilling sound that seemed to echo inside his skull. "We are with you now, always, until you face the truth." The figure in the rearview mirror leaned closer. It was Eleanor, her face pale and hollow, her eyes piercing through the darkness. "Turn around, Alex," she whispered. "No," Alex screamed, slamming his foot on the gas pedal. The car roared forward, tearing out of the parking lot and onto the empty road. He drove blindly, the darkness around him seeming to close in. The headlights barely cut through the inky blackness, and the road twisted and turned in ways that felt unfamiliar, unnatural. And then, in the distance, he saw it. The Hill House. Its dark silhouette loomed against the night sky, impossibly large, as though it had grown in his absence. The windows glowed faintly, like eyes watching him, waiting. "No," Alex whispered, shaking his head. "I left. I got out, but the car wouldn't stop. The steering wheel seemed to have a life of its own, pulling him closer to the house." The whispers grew louder, surrounding him, drowning out his thoughts. As he reached the driveway, the car screeched to a halt. The engine died, leaving him in complete silence. The front door of Hill House creaked open, and the faint scent of roses wafted through the air. Eleanor's voice came again, soft and coaxing. "It's time to come home, Alex." Alex gripped the steering wheel tightly, his body frozen as if the house itself had stolen his will to move. The front door of Hill House stood open, dark and yawning, its invitation unmistakable. The whispers returned, swirling around him like a vortex, voices overlapping in a cacophony that made it impossible to think. Each one sounded familiar, snatches of conversations he'd had, regrets he'd buried, and fears he'd refused to name. "You can't hide forever," Eleanor's voice whispered, cutting through the chaos like a blade. Alex shut his eyes tightly, trying to block it all out. He reached for the ignition, desperate to start the car again, to escape, but the key wouldn't turn. The steering wheel was unresponsive, as though the car itself was conspiring against him. The air inside grew colder, so frigid that frost began to creep along the windows. His breath came out in visible puffs, and his trembling hands felt numb against the cold metal of the keys. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A figure emerged from the open door of the house, its shape shadowy but unmistakably human. As it stepped closer, Alex recognized the hunched shoulders, the worn jacket, the slightly uneven gait. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. The figure stopped a few feet from the car, its face still obscured by shadow. But Alex didn't need to see his face. He could feel it in his gut. It was his father, or at least something wearing his father's form. "You left us," the figure said, its voice low and full of accusation. "You walked away and never looked back." Alex's throat tightened. "You don't understand. You had to run," the figure interrupted, stepping closer. The frost on the windows thickened, and the whispers grew louder. "You've always run, Alex. From responsibility, from guilt, from us." Tears burned in Alex's eyes, but he refused to look away. "You don't know what it was like. You were always so hard on me. Always. You failed us," the figure hissed, cutting him off again. "Just like you failed everyone else." Alex's chest heaved, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. He slammed his fists against the steering wheel, the frustration and fear boiling over. "I tried. I've been trying my whole life. What more do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, the gesture eerily reminiscent of Eleanor's earlier movements. "We want you to face it, all of it." Behind his father's form, more figures began to emerge from the shadows, stepping out of the house's open door. Jonathan Crane was among them, his sharp eyes boring into Alex like daggers. Beside him stood a young woman Alex didn't recognize, her face streaked with tears, her hands clutching at a blood-stained dress. One by one, more figures appeared, their expressions a mix of sorrow and blame. Each one represented a fragment of Alex's past, a person he had wronged, ignored, or abandoned. "You carry us with you," his father said, his voice soft now, but no less haunting. "We are your burden, Alex, and we will haunt you until you confront the truth." Alex shook his head, his tears spilling freely. I don't even know where to start." The whispers softened, almost becoming a hum, as Eleanor's voice returned, soothing and relentless. "The house knows, Alex. It always knows. Come inside. Face what you fear, and maybe, just maybe, you'll be free." The figures parted, leaving a clear path from the car to the open door of Hill House. Alex sat frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to find another way to escape. But deep down, he knew there was no running from this, not anymore. With a shaky breath, he opened the car door and stepped out. The cold air bit at his skin, and the weight of the house pressed down on him with every step he took toward the door. The scent of roses grew stronger, mingling with something darker, more metallic. As he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him. The house greeted him with silence. The air inside was heavy, oppressive, as though it carried the weight of centuries. The flickering candlelight cast long, distorted shadows across the walls, and the faint hum of the whispers lingered just beneath the surface. Alex stood in the center of the grand foyer, his body tense, his fists clenched. "All right," he said, his voice echoing in the vast emptiness. "I'm here. Let's finish this." The house seemed to respond, its walls creaking and groaning as if alive. The staircase before him stretched impossibly high, spiraling into darkness, and from the shadows above, a voice called out, "Come, Alex. We're waiting." Alex stared up the staircase, its wooden steps stretching upward into an unnatural darkness. The voice from above, familiar yet distorted, sent a shiver down his spine. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and took the first step. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight, echoing through the silent house. As he climbed, the air seemed to thicken, making it harder to breathe. Shadows danced along the walls, their shapes twisting and writhing as though alive. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the house itself was trying to hold him back. Memories began to surface, unbidden and vivid, snapshots of his childhood, moments he had buried deep. He saw his father, towering over him, his face red with anger. "You'll never amount to anything if you keep running away." He heard his mother's soft, resigned voice. "Just let him go, John. He's never going to change." He saw himself as a teenager, storming out of the house after yet another argument, vowing never to return. The whispers grew louder, their words indistinct but laced with accusation. Alex clenched his fists, forcing himself to keep moving. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretched before him, lined with closed doors. Each door seemed to radiate its own energy, some cold, some warm, some pulsating with an almost magnetic pull. One door at the far end stood slightly ajar, faint light spilling out from the crack. As Alex approached it, the whispers coalesced into a single voice, Eleanor's. "This is where it begins, Alex. Step inside." His hand trembled as he pushed the door open. The room beyond was a perfect replica of his childhood bedroom. The twin bed, the desk piled with old comic books, the faded posters on the walls. All of it was exactly as he remembered. But something was wrong. The air was too still, too quiet. On the bed sat a boy. Alex froze. The boy looked up, and Alex's breath caught. It was him, a younger version of himself, no more than 10 years old. The boy's wide eyes were filled with fear, his small hands clutching a stuffed bear. "Why did you leave me?" the boy asked, his voice trembling. Alex's chest tightened. I had to. I couldn't stay." The boy shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "You left me here. You left me with him." The room darkened, the edges of the walls dissolving into shadow. The stuffed bear fell from the boy's hands, and he began to fade, his form dissolving like smoke. "No," Alex shouted, reaching for the boy, but it was too late. He was gone. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The shadows closed in around Alex, pressing against him, suffocating him. From the corner of the room, a new figure emerged. It was his father, his face twisted with anger and disappointment. "You can't escape what you are," he growled. "You're a coward, Alex. Always have been." "No," Alex shouted, backing away. "I'm not that person anymore." The shadows swirled around his father, twisting and reshaping him into something monstrous. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his voice deepened, echoing with the house's malevolence. "You can't outrun the truth. You belong to us now." Alex stumbled back, his mind racing. The walls of the room seemed to pulse, the shadows growing thicker, darker. But amidst the chaos, he heard a faint sound, a child's laugh, light and pure. He turned toward it, and there she was, Eleanor, standing in the doorway, her smile serene but her eyes sharp. "Do you see now, Alex?" she asked, her voice calm and measured. "The house doesn't want to hurt you. It wants you to see, to understand." "Understand what?" Alex shouted, his voice breaking. "That I'm a failure? That I'm a coward? What more do you want from me?" Eleanor stepped closer, her expression softening. "The house doesn't create your fears. It shows you what you've buried, the truth you've been too afraid to face." The shadows around his father began to dissolve, revealing the man as he had truly been, not a monster, but a broken, flawed human being. And then Alex saw it, his own reflection in the window, older and worn, but alive. He wasn't a child anymore. He wasn't trapped in the past. The whispers faded, replaced by a profound silence. Eleanor reached out, her hand hovering just above his. "It's time to choose, Alex. Will you let the past consume you, or will you finally let it go?" Alex stared at her hand, his mind racing. He knew this was the moment. The house had brought him here for a reason. But could he truly face what lay ahead? Alex's heart raced as he stood in the center of the room, Eleanor's outstretched hand hovering just inches from his. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, the suffocating silence all around him except for the faint sound of his own heartbeat. He glanced around at the shadows that had once seemed so ominous, now fading into the corners of the room, retreating into the dark recesses of the house. His father, no longer a monster but a man, stood motionless, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and sorrow. The house felt different now, not as threatening, but still alive, still watching. "Let it go, Alex." Eleanor's voice was soft, almost gentle, as though it were a plea. "You don't have to carry this burden anymore." But the question remained, could he? He had spent his entire life running. From his father's harsh words, from the weight of expectations, from the guilt that had wrapped around him like chains. And now, here he stood, confronted by all of it. The house wasn't just a building. It was a reflection of him, a mirror to his soul, showing him every part of himself he had tried to forget. "I'm not the same person I was," Alex said, his voice trembling as he finally spoke. "I've changed. I've tried to make up for everything." Eleanor nodded, her eyes understanding but still sharp. "Trying isn't enough, Alex. You can't change the past, but you can choose how you carry it forward." The darkness seemed to recede, and Alex could almost hear the house exhale, as though it had been holding its breath for far too long. He felt a strange sense of calm, even as his chest tightened with the weight of his choices. He could feel the truth hanging in the air, like the final piece of a puzzle that he hadn't been able to see. "Do you want to let it go?" Eleanor asked again. The door behind her, once open, now stood ajar. Through it, Alex could see a faint light shining from somewhere beyond the house. It wasn't a place of warmth or peace, but it was a place of freedom. His mind flashed back to the moments of his past, the arguments with his father, the times he'd walked away instead of staying. He could see the faces of the people he'd hurt, the things he had abandoned in search of something better. But there was one thing he had never done: face the pain, face the loss. His eyes flicked to his father, who stood in the corner, his face soft with the traces of their shared history. The man who had raised him, who had pushed him so hard, who had left deep scars. "I didn't ask for your forgiveness," Alex said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I want to forgive myself." The figure of his father nodded, a brief, silent understanding passing between them. The moment was heavy with unsaid words, but it was enough. The house trembled, as if acknowledging Alex's decision. Alex turned back to Eleanor, his hand shaking but resolute. Slowly he reached out, his fingers brushing hers. The touch wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was real. The house groaned, the walls sighing, as if the weight of centuries was finally being lifted. Alex felt a tug in his chest, a weight that had been with him for so long that he hadn't realized how much it had held him down. The house, with all its ghosts and memories, seemed to recognize his choice. "Let it go," Eleanor said one last time. Alex nodded, a small tear slipping down his cheek. It was the first time he had allowed himself to cry since he had entered Hill House, and it felt like a release, like the house was finally letting him go. He had faced his past, confronted the darkest corners of his soul, and now he was free. As soon as he released her hand, the light in the doorway grew brighter. The oppressive weight in the room lightened. The whispers stopped, leaving only the sound of his own steady breathing. He turned to leave, stepping past Eleanor into the light. The door to Hill House closed softly behind him, its creaks and groans fading into the distance. As Alex stepped outside, he breathed deeply, feeling the fresh, crisp air fill his lungs. The house, the curse, the shadows, they were all behind him now. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of the past lift from his shoulders. The road ahead was unknown, but it was his to walk. And as he stood at the threshold, looking back one final time at the dark silhouette of Hill House against the night sky, Alex realized something. He hadn't just left the house, he had left himself behind. As Alex stepped away from Hill House, his footsteps slow and measured, a sense of quiet stillness settled over him. He had walked away from the house, but in truth, he was walking into something far more daunting. The future. The weight of the past still lingered in his bones, like a shadow he couldn't fully escape. But for the first time, he felt like he had the strength to face it. The road stretched out before him, long and winding, disappearing into the horizon. The faint light from the distant street lamp flickered like a beacon, guiding him forward, but the darkness still surrounded him. He knew the journey wasn't over. In the distance, a car approached, headlights cutting through the night. It was the same dusty, old sedan he had seen parked at the motel earlier. Alex's heart skipped a beat, the unease creeping back into his chest. He stopped in his tracks, uncertainty flooding his thoughts. The car slowed and came to a stop next to him. The passenger window rolled down, and inside, he saw a familiar face. It was Jonathan Crane, the man he had once known as a friend and later as someone who seemed to know far more about Hill House than he let on. His face was gaunt, his eyes dark and tired, but there was a knowing look in them. "You're not done yet, are you?" Jonathan's voice was calm, almost too calm, as if he had been waiting for Alex to make this very decision. Alex hesitated, torn between walking away and facing what might be ahead. "What do you mean?" I let it go. "I'm free now." Jonathan gave a short, humorless laugh. "You think the house is done with you just because you left. It doesn't let go that easily." Alex shook his head, anger rising. "You were there. You saw what I did. I confronted it. I made my choice." Jonathan's expression darkened. "That's not how it works. The house doesn't just leave you, Alex. It's part of you now, and it knows you better than you know yourself. If you think you can walk away unscathed, you're wrong." Alex's mind raced. The moment he had stepped outside of Hill House, he thought he had escaped its grip, but now, standing in front of Jonathan, doubt crept in once again. Had he truly escaped? Or had he only managed to leave one nightmare for another? "What do you want from me?" Alex asked, his voice low and sharp. "What more do you know?" Jonathan sighed, his gaze shifting toward the house, now a distant silhouette in the night. "I've been watching you, Alex. I know the house has taken something from you, something you can't quite remember. You've buried it deep inside, but it's still there. The house doesn't let go, not until it's had its fill." Alex's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about? What's still there?" Jonathan's eyes hardened. "The truth, Alex. The house doesn't just show you what you've done. It shows you what you've forgotten. You were always meant to return. The question is, can you face it a second time?" The car's engine hummed softly, the only sound in the still night air. The darkness pressed in on all sides, and the road seemed to stretch out endlessly before Alex. Hill House, though far behind him, loomed large in his mind. Jonathan's words echoed in his thoughts, stirring something deep within him. Could he truly be free? Or had Hill House simply allowed him to leave for a time, only to wait for the right moment to pull him back in? "I don't want to go back," Alex said, his voice shaking with the uncertainty he was trying so hard to suppress. "You don't have a choice," Jonathan replied. "Not anymore. Whatever you left behind in that house is going to catch up with you. It always does." Alex glanced back at the house, the silhouette now barely visible against the dark sky. The air seemed to thicken, as though it was watching him, waiting for him to make his move. He could feel it deep in his chest, the pull of something ancient and cold. "You know what you have to do," Jonathan said quietly. "You know the truth is still inside you. Let it out. If you don't, it'll destroy you." Alex closed his eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had confronted the past, but had he truly faced everything it had to offer? Could he really move forward, or would he always be tethered to the house and its endless whispers? "I won't go back," Alex whispered to himself, a silent vow rising in his chest. "I can't. I won't let it take me again." Jonathan gave him a long, searching look, as though measuring his resolve. "You'll regret this," he said softly. "But then again, everyone does." With that, Jonathan rolled up the window and drove off into the night, disappearing down the winding road. Alex stood alone in the middle of the desolate stretch of highway, his breath visible in the cold night air. The world felt heavier now, the choices weighing more than they had before. He had said no. He had rejected the house. But could he escape the past? Could he truly outrun what was left inside him? Alex didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing. His journey was far from over. He had stepped away from Hill House, but Hill House was never far from him. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, Alex felt like he had a choice in how it would end. Alex stood alone on the road, the sound of the car's engine fading into the distance. The wind stirred the dry leaves along the roadside, but the world around him remained eerily still. His heart still raced, his chest still tight with the weight of the choices he had just made. The darkness of the night seemed to stretch endlessly before him, the faintest hint of the house's shadow lingering at the edge of his mind. But as the minutes passed, something began to change. The road before him seemed to shift, like a ribbon twisting in the air, pulling him back toward a place he had sworn never to return to. His feet felt heavier with each step, and he suddenly felt the cold grasp of something deep inside him. The same darkness, the same truth that had never fully left him. His heart began to thud loudly in his chest, a pulse he couldn't ignore. He turned his head, the air around him thick with an uncanny chill. For a brief moment, he thought he saw the faint outline of Hill House in the distance, standing on the edge of the woods, its silhouette barely visible against the dark sky. But it wasn't just the house. It was something else, something inside him. The truth that had eluded him, the piece of himself he had forgotten, was coming to the surface. It wasn't just the house. It was the way he had run his entire life, from his father, from his mistakes, from the fear of confronting what he was really afraid of. The house hadn't haunted him. He had haunted himself. And now, the truth was staring him in the face. His hand gripped his chest as a wave of nausea hit him. His breaths grew shallow, and he staggered back, struggling to stay on his feet. In his mind, he saw flashes his childhood, his father's angry words, his mother's resignation. He had blamed them, blamed Hill House, blamed everyone but himself. But now he understood. It wasn't their fault. It was his own fear, his own refusal to face what had happened. He had spent years avoiding the very thing he needed to confront. The whispers returned, but this time they weren't the house's voice. They were his. They were the voices of his regrets, his guilt, his past. They had always been there, lying dormant in his mind. He had never truly let go of them. He had only buried them deeper, pretending they didn't exist. In that moment, Alex realized that he was the one who had to let go. not just of Hill House, but of the version of himself that he had been running from for so long. The road before him no longer felt endless. It felt like a choice. He could go back to the house, face the truth head-on, and confront the final pieces of his past. Or he could keep walking forward, knowing that the journey wasn't about escaping. It was about facing what he had been too afraid to acknowledge. He didn't need to fight the house or the darkness anymore. He needed to fight himself. The house had never been the enemy. He had been his own. With one last, steadying breath, Alex made his decision. He turned and walked back, not toward Hill House, but into the night, the first step toward healing, toward accepting the pain, the guilt, and the fear, not as something to run from, but as part of him, something he could finally understand and release. He wasn't just leaving the house behind. He was leaving the version of himself that couldn't move forward. As he walked into the vast unknown, the weight of the past finally lifted, not because it was forgotten, but because he had finally accepted it. And for the first time, Alex felt the road ahead was not a haunting, but a chance to finally live without the shadows of Hill House looming over him. The whispers stopped, and in their place, there was only silence. The kind of silence that comes when one has truly let go. The end.